Good day, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in our cyber risk governance discussions. Today we have another special guest. We try to make it special for every time. Yes, is somebody that we are very interested to have this discussions. And thank you, Orion, for sharing your insight and joining us on this cyber risk governance webinar. So my name is Stanley Lee, founder and CEO of NetSwitch, and we have Sean and Orion. And Sean, why don't you introduce yourself and also introduce our guests?
I'm Sean Mahoney. I'm Stanley's business partner, and today we have Orion Inskip join us. Orion is a cyber attorney, former Army officer. Sorry, Orion, I almost said Navy. Um, and Orion's background is helping organizations understand the complicated nature of regulatory compliance, and so he's bringing the military discipline with the legal expertise to help organizations make security scope defensible, practical, and aligned with business objectives. Orion, thanks for joining us today. One of the things that I think we need to
Yeah,
start
thanks for inviting me.
one of the things we need to start with is really sort of setting the groundwork, because we don't always understand the awareness of some of the people that are joining these events. So when we talk about scope, that's a fairly technical compliance term, but so let's understand what scope means. I try to explain scope to people as you want homeowners insurance, but if you only insure your living room because of the great flat screen TV and the really comfortable lazy boy, but you don't insure your kitchen burns down, you've got problems. And if you try to insure everything in your house, including that really disposable printer that you have, that becomes too costly. So understanding what you have in your home that is of value that should be insured is a way to understand scope. Now, have I said anything that I've put myself into legal jeopardy in trying to explain that?
No, and I
Oh, God.
often use the house analogy as well. Um, um,
Excellent.
when I try to explain to people scope, because there's a always a desire to reduce the scope, because the larger the scope, as you pointed out, the more expensive it is. So people are always trying to pare down that scope, and in
And
doing
it's an
that,
opportunity for an
especially with
external auditor to find problems that you didn't address, right?
right. So you might, if your scope is too large, and the auditor starts to ask questions about something that you didn't that you left in scope but you didn't really address, then you've got more. We'll call it audit surface area, right? So risk surface area or audit risk surface area. Um, but there's a desire, especially on the CMMC side, to do what's called an enclave, right? So
Okay.
what people will do is they'll try to create a very small enclave just for the CMMC data. The problem with that is if you need that data in your operational environment and you need to be able to use it, um, people are really bad. I think our experience over the last 5 years or so with the pandemic and everything, people are bad about left seat, right seat, or screen shifting and going from one environment to another environment. So you have to have a
Yeah.
completely separate environment. That it is one way to address it, but think of it again as the house analogy you used. You're now building a second house, right? That you then have to put all the same security things around that you need. So, I mean, you've got to
Right.
put your door locks and your windows and smoke alarms and CO2 detectors. You have to have all that same stuff in place in the second house, the enclave, even if it's only a studio apartment. You've still got to secure it pretty much the same way. And then all of the tools you need to use to do your job have to be copied over there as well, which now you're talking about additional licenses, which cost more. So you're going to have a
Right.
license for inside the enclave and a license for outside the enclave. So I don't foresee in the long term the enclave approach being the best way to go. I think there's a break even point of maybe 5% or 10% of your employees. If that's all you have and they're specialized people and they're pretty competent, then yeah, they can probably manage shifting from one environment to the other environment. Where I think FedRAMP 20X is pushing this is that
Okay.
rather than have, for instance, a FedRAMP unique product in your CSP offerings, that you actually take the controls or the requirements from FedRAMP and put that on your commercial product and you run it as one environment. I think that's intimidating and scares people, and everybody's, oh my God, we can't do that. Everything breaks. But at some point, none of the things that we're being asked to do in FedRAMP or in CMMC, DFARS 7012, NIST 800-171 are things that you probably shouldn't be doing. I mean, they're all security requirements that everyone should probably have in place, especially with 171, because 171 is different than what you see over in FedRAMP because it only looks at 1/3 of your security triad. It's only looking at confidentiality. It doesn't look at your integrity and availability controls. The
Right.
mistake that a lot of people have done is they try to build their 800-171 enclave, and then they don't even put in the controls for integrity and availability. Those aren't even in their security plan. So, I mean, if you read the strict interpretation of CMMC, NIST 800-171, you don't have to have backups. But I'm pretty sure everybody's going to agree backups are an important part of any environment. And
Right.
so what they say is that if you have backups, they need to be encrypted. Oh yeah, and if they're encrypted, they have to be encrypted with FIPS validated cryptography. But
Right.
I mean, if you did that in the initial build of your environment, it's not hard to do. I mean, it's a lot easier to do it up front and build it right in the first place than it is to come back and try to overlay that on an existing operational environment.
So when you're having conversations with an organization and maybe they've addressed some of these cyber issues, they haven't, where they need to have some sort of compliance. When they're regulated industries, it's fairly easy. But when it's not a regulated industry, it's by choice. So it's organizational choice, and they establish that with governance. Where do you suggest that they start in their defining of their scope?
Well, I think the simple answer to that is, have you defined your crown jewels? Have you done an inventory of your assets to determine which assets are the most valuable to your company? And then you build your initial scope around protecting those assets. And that may mean you have to re-engineer your system so that those critical assets, those crown jewels, aren't in as many places as they might be today. You might have to move them and control and put them in a controlled space. But frankly, if you don't know what you have, it's really hard to know how to protect it.
Right.
And so that's the first part, is always going to be to do the inventory of your assets and then start building a boundary around the things that are the most critical. And in doing so, you can also do what's called an objective risk assessment, where you actually attach monetary values to those assets, and you can determine how much of a risk in a fiscal risk you have with those assets. And that gives you the ability then to look at those vulnerabilities and those threats and define your risks and see what the monetary impact, the actual monetary impact, is for that risk. That can help you with making your decisions, your business decisions, based on, how much is this going to cost? Well, it's going to cost X number of dollars, but that's a whole lot less than the risk that we have over the next 12 months based on not doing something.
True. Staley, without him being prompted there, it almost sounds like he just explained our ebook of the business impact analysis playbook that we wrote, right? Really,
Well,
it's
why
just
do you think I invited him?
But it's you need to understand what's at risk. What is going to keep your company from being able to do what it's supposed to do. And
Right.
so you have those conversations with an organization, and especially with executive management, where they can bring in operations. If this goes down, can we still operate? No. Well,
that starts
okay.
to go into the
we
business
got to
business
protect
continuity.
that. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. So that is the business continuity part of this conversation, which,
Right.
again, things like CMMC, they don't care about your business continuity. That's not part of the control set that you see in CMMC.
Right.
In my previous job as a director of GRC, we had the ISO certification for business continuity as well as for cybersecurity. So, we did in fact look at the business continuity side, and we put that all into, because the way ISO is structured is you have a control, a management system in place, right? As opposed to building it from the controls up, you build it from the management system down. And that management system is the same in ISO. It's the same in whether you're looking at a 9001 or an ISO 27001. That structure is the same, so that you can plug these other pieces in, like business continuity,
Right.
well, a lot more seamlessly. If you want to expand the 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 things you're looking at, because that's really what you're doing, right? You may be doing all of these things, but are you doing them and documenting them and actually improving? When you have a tabletop exercise, are you improving your controls based on what you just learned, your lessons learned, and
That's right.
documenting that whole process? And that's where NIST CSF, the NIST RMF, and the ISO management system structures all try to get companies to go. Unfortunately, what I see more often than not is everybody wants to get to the end state of, just tell me what I have to do to be in compliance,
Right.
right?
And that
And
checkbox compliance isn't going to do you much. It'll get you through an audit.
no, right. It'll get you through the audit. And I think we can see with the prevalence of $3,500 SOC 2 audits that those are pretty much devalued at this point. Like if you've got a SOC 2 audit that report, and you spent $3,500 on it, and you didn't do much to improve your environment before you even had that audit. So, really you just hired this auditor, they came in, they asked a few questions, and then boom, you've got yourself a report.
Do, do.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
And that's what we've talked about, the static nature of that snapshot in time for a SOC 2
yeah,
report, like many of the reports, not to pick on SOC 2, and I didn't in the article I wrote, but any of those type of reports, they're snapshots in time. One thing I want to touch briefly on is you were talking about business continuity, and for people dealing with something like CMMC, they need the compliance, and that's important for their contract, and it's important for their prime if they're a sub.
yeah,
But the business continuity is important to the entire procurement chain. So don't dismiss everything else you're dealing with in business continuity of having to address those sort of things, because in the procurement evaluation of their vendor analysis, they want to know, if you have a cyber incident, okay, you have secured the CUI, but can you recover to be a vendor to us next day? And if you
right.
can't, you're not a valuable vendor.
Well, and again, in the government contracting world, the reason why CMMC NIST 800-171 is pared down is because the government is intentionally trying to be hands off in how you
Right,
operate your business, right?
right,
So that's on you, on how you want to operate your business. If you don't want to have locks on your front door, as long as the CUI stays secured, they don't care, right? You don't have smoke detectors in your house, they don't care. I mean, if you back to the, I guess expanding on that analogy of the house, what they care about is if the actual CUI is protected from leaking out, right?
right,
The data loss prevention part. And so it's going to be much more DLP focused than it is going to be business continuity focused.
right.
And I think it's at your detriment as a business to think that way, for sure.
Right. So let's touch back on the static nature of those reports. Stanley, you've talked often about um, real-time visibility of security postures. You have any thoughts on that you want to share?
Yeah,
I know you
actually,
usually do.
yeah, of course I do. So these are the things that goes back. Actually, you guys talking about the house analogy. Now I'm talking about the analogy of the insurance company that insuring the policy, securing the house. So from the insurance underwriting perspective, now that they're starting to have a one-time evaluation on an annual policies that they come in and check, whether you check all those boxes like Sean, you talk about.
Yeah.
But now into the process, 6 months down the road, the company got hacked. And then now they start looking into the fine prints. And of course, that's Orion, that's where you come in from. How do you defend that? Because now, of course, this process could drag on for months, if not years. And the business is actually, try to operate. If they're a big company, I'm sure they have contingency fund to operate in that area. But what about the mid-sized company that we dealt with, and how could they address those compliance, what we call the compliance evidence, not only just for the compliance requirement, but the insurance company, and hiding everything we're talking about as a risk management. Of course, we're using NIST 8286 as a framework to define our product developments, which is integrating cybersecurity and enterprise risk management. So Sean, this is kind of where my thought goes into now with our discussions with the financial executive
Right.
groups, risk management group. Just talked to a professor from Columbia, talking about, well, how do we even evaluate this underwriting process when they don't even have, some sort of assessment coming from a third party, because of the insurance broker might not even know how to ask those questions. So that becomes part of the risk management I try to think of it from a preventive strategy and adaptive strategy, as all these cybersecurity attacks keep changing, and also from the compliance keep evolving, adding into multiple framework that an organizations needs to comply. And one of our audience have already asked, the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, and all of that ties into the mix of compliance evidence. How do we monitoring on a regular basis that can be cost effective? So I know that's
Yeah.
a load of questions in there, but yeah, just speak
Well,
from the compliance evidence perspective in
yeah,
your
I mean, to where you started with that on the insurance company side, right? Insurance companies are going to, and I think if you've tried to get cyber insurance recently, you'll have experienced this. They're going to start to ask for higher and higher levels of assurance that your environment they're insuring has some baselines of security in place. And when you go read that policy, your policy is going to say that you need to have X, Y, and Z in place. And so if you don't have those things in place and you do end up having a breach, well, guess what? You didn't meet the requirements of the insurance policy. The insurance policy may not cover you anymore, right? And here's where that's going to become more and more contentious. Most of the time, the first phone call that people make in that breach situation is going to be to their insurance company. Well, that insurance company is going to assign an attorney and a forensics team to come in and look and try to figure out what the cause was. Well, if they go through your system and find out that you represented that you had all of these controls in place and you didn't, then it's on the insurance company's best interest to find a way to not have to pay the claim. So this is a reason why it's probably best to call your attorney before you call the insurance company, and have your attorney initiate the internal investigation under the umbrella of attorney work product, and bring in their own investigative team, which is all under attorney work product, so that you can get a root cause identified before or during the concurrent investigation that the insurance company is doing. Now, is that going to 100% protect you from the insurance company coming back and saying, well, you said you had MFA in place, but you didn't, and that's why you keep getting hacked, is because you have a simple password requirement for your users and no multi-factor authentication. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a risk that you're going to have with the insurance companies, and probably where, I mean, let's be real here. The thing that's going to force companies to actually get this stuff done is going to be the insurance companies. It's not going to be government regulations. It's going to be the fact that they can't get insured, and without being insured, well, other companies aren't going to do business with you, right? Because they're going to want to see that you have some level of insurance. And if the insurance companies come and they look at your environment, and they're going to start looking more and more closely. I don't know that the actuarial tables that insurance companies use for estimating risk and setting the price for insurance are fully developed enough yet for cyber risk.
Not the cyber.
Yeah, so right now they're just shooting in the dark, right?
Yep.
They're making their best guess on what your insurance policy should cost based on how much. But if you don't even know what your assets are and how much they're worth and where they're at, how's the insurance company going to know that, right? So
Yeah, this
again, I
is
think it comes back to you have to have a good inventory of your assets.
yeah, and then go back into what we talking about. How do we keeping it simple, right?
Yeah,
And you absolutely correct. And this is where the conversations that I try to convince all the business executive, the decision maker. Look, we have to look at it from a different perspective. On cybersecurity, we need to look at it. Don't look at it from technical perspective. And some of them, what we talk about, and also comment being posted while we're talking about this is, let's start from the basic, keep it simple, business impact analysis, which is also recommended on NIST 8286 as a starting point. I find it funny that, when you read the 8286, they got like, the ABCD, but they put the BIA as the D, why
Right.
isn't started? Okay, so okay, they put it on the bottom rather they put it on the top. So this is where we coming in from. It's like, okay, we put that BIA together. It's a playbook and a worksheet. Thank you for some of our contributors in our group. Mike Hager especially mentioned, shout out on him. He started that. So this is something that we share from that anybody wants to look at that. But then go back into the executive role. And yes, about 5, 6 years ago when I started this journey, yes, insurance company, well, how do you underwrite? Well, nobody can answer my questions. And also more importantly on that, to tie it into Orion, your point is, and Sean's point, how do we continuously monitor that risk rather than an annualized one-time things that they do? Yes, now that, okay, I got my insurance policy, great, I'm going to ignore everything else. I'm just going to move on to my old business as usual. I don't care about it anymore. But now when we got hacked 6 months later, is the insurance company going to look at what I have done 6 months ago, or are they going to look at what I have done today?
That's right.
When
yeah,
that hack
yeah.
happened. So
No, and it's if we want to look at insurance in a way that probably more people will understand, is if you had a 16-year-old driver in your house, you're going to get a better rate from the insurance company if you put one of those driver monitoring devices on that car, right?
Exactly.
And so that that continuous monitoring, is going to give a better idea of what the actual risk is in an ongoing basis. So that um, if you have a SOC, a security operations center, you have the ability to do that continuous monitoring, and 24/7, somebody's watching what's happening in your traffic, and you're watching events, and you have a SIEM, and maybe you have a security orchestration, the SOAR. If you've got all that stuff in place, well, now it would make sense that your insurance rates should go down, right? But if like you said, Stanley, if all I have is that snapshot from when we bought the policy, and 6 months later, now we're doing an investigation to see if you were still doing the things you said you were doing then, well, now we're going to run into the problem of, yeah, well, did you meet your part of the insurance contract, right? Because that's really what this is. You're telling the insurance company, yes, we're going to comply with these things. And if you don't, then you were the one that breached the contract, so they have no duty to pay you.
Right.
After that.
Stanley and I have worked with customers where they are getting those questionnaires from the insurance companies, and they're answering them to their knowledge.
Right.
Yes. Yes. And we're like, whoa, 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 whoa. No, hold on. You told us not to make sure you had MFA turned on for the CEO over this data set because they wanted immediate access to it.
Right.
You just answered you have MFA turned on across the organization. You don't. So, it's understanding little things like that, or that they don't think that, well, if I turn it on now, I can show them that I'm actually doing this. And then because it's too expensive, they turn it off in 2 months.
Yeah. Well, and zero trust, I think, because
Right.
everybody loves to use the term zero trust.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've been in assessments with assessors and auditors that you tell them you're doing zero trust, and they're like, oh, because they don't really understand it either.
Right.
Right?
It's
And they're
good
like,
term.
oh,
It
okay,
sounds
you're doing
good.
zero trust, you're good to go. And it's like, yeah, no, let's dig a little deeper and see, what's the evidence that each one of these critical assets that we identified in
Right.
that inventory actually has protections in place that require um, identification and authorization before somebody has access to it, and is that access being logged? Right?
Right.
So we know who's logged in and who's affected that information, and
Yeah.
any changes, are the changes to that information being logged? So I mean, that's where
Well,
you're
I'm going to put you on the spot about this too, because prior to,
yeah,
I told you about that, so I warned you about that.
okay,
Prior to we got on to live, streaming on this, you're working with 75 supply chain vendors for this organizations.
yeah,
And one thing why I put you on the spot, you mentioned that, 75 is same as one in a sense, right? You do a cookie cutter and then you duplicate it. Now, but how do you monitoring all those 75 of them?
right,
Because at any
yeah,
given point in time, your supply chain somewhere in that 75 suppliers is going to break.
Right.
Then is it going to be that organization's liability, or how do you trigger it down? Of course, I know what runs downhill, right? When when something happens. So how do you, as a legal counsel from the legal
yeah,
perspective, and also as a cybersecurity, expert on this, how do you monitoring those 75 supply chains? And you know what? Yesterday I had this similar conversation. You know what? I just ship product. It's none of my business in cybersecurity. That's one
yeah,
of the supply chain. Literally,
yeah,
I just ship products. Why do I care? And
yeah,
drop off the call.
yeah. um I mean, i think at the end of the day, these companies have to look at how dependent they are on those vendors, right? And when I say those vendors, what is an MSP? A managed service provider is just one of your vendors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Question is, can you fire that MSP and hire another one tomorrow without upsetting your business continuity? Like, and if you can't, like if that isn't something that you can do easily, then that should be logged in your risks with
Mm-hmm.
with business continuity, business impact assessment, because that means that vendor is definitely a critical vendor,
Right.
because you can't live without them and you can't easily replace them. So I would, if I was out there advising companies that are hiring MSPs, I would be very clear to them that you need to own this, right? It's still your environment. You're still accountable. You can delegate responsibility to these vendors to do certain things for you, but at the end of the day, you're still accountable to your contract, right?
It's
To
amazing
whoever
how
you're
often
working for.
they don't understand the retained liability.
Right, right. And that's, so I mean, I think, and again, because of this is where I'm working the most in the CMMC supply chain, you look at that prime contractor and then you go all the way down sub. Well, that requirement, if it was on the prime and the information flows down to all those subs, the requirement goes with it. But those subs
Mm-hmm.
don't have privity of contract anymore with the federal government. They have contract with the prime or the other subs.
Right.
And so it's going to become a contract dispute between the sub to the prime. It isn't going to be a False Claims Act necessarily, but the prime might get the False Claims Act because the prime is attesting that their
That's right.
subs are in compliance.
Correct.
So if it turns out that their subs weren't, and the prime didn't do a good enough job to verify that, then you're making a false claim to the government. You said you did it and you didn't, and so that you could see the false claims liability come up, which has civil and sometimes criminal penalties in there. And then you have contract disputes. And again, the small, medium-sized businesses, they're probably not going to be able to absorb a contract dispute like that, right?
Right.
They're going to be like, oh, well, this was good. Let's go start a new startup. we're going to go ahead and close this business and open up
Yeah.
another one. So, and I mean, my background before all this was aviation, and we saw that in aviation all the time
Mm-hmm.
because everything in aviation is so ridiculously expensive, and the margins are so tight. You have one incident, and that company's probably going out of business.
Right.
They may open up as another company the next day, but that entity dies.
Yeah.
Right.
And this, but still going back into the insurance policy, now the prime still have to, and then of course the insurance company come back and say, hey, this is, something on your own. We just going to look at you as the prime. I don't care how you monitor, measure the cyber resilience down your stream, on your upstream or downstream. Is still your liability now because of that one weakest link in the process. I'm not going to pay out the policy. Is that
right?
Is that correct?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And that's the whole thing with read the small print. You got to read your contract and read what's in that master service agreement and even statements of work, and make sure that if there is a requirement that you paint your bathrooms pink and you didn't, that could be used against you. I mean, it could be, and then those are the kinds of crazy, things that might show up in a contract because you didn't read it.
Well, there's several comments I want to address as well from our audience. One of them is, Stephen have used the word borderless. I don't even know how to pronounce that. So basically, Stephen, I talked to him, so Canadian, maybe French, it's that word. Yes, it's going into the the end layers of the complexity. And of course, that he put on one of the comment I really love is accountability versus responsibilities. So how would you address that, Orion, from you playing from a technologist role as well as the legal role, and now you have to address that to the organization? And if the business executive doesn't understand about this risk management and build it into the culture, that all those stakeholders involved, including the external vendors that participate and able to produce the data to meet those compliance requirements, how would a CEO or C-suite in the prime looking at the accountability and responsibility to fulfill that contract? And another comment onto that is when most of those contracts are secrets within their organization. And you or us as a risk assessor coming in here and try to evaluate, we can only do so much for them. If they don't want to share those secrets to our evaluation and an assessment, whose liability would that be at the end of the day?
I mean, if you don't insure against your own risks, and then when you look at your subcontractors and you only look at one level deep beyond your subcontractor and you don't look at their subs, right? Then you need to make sure that that sub has sufficient resources, insurance, to be able to cover the loss that might occur to you if that sub fails.
That's right.
Right. So if I have a subcontractor that is critical to me, and then it turns out that they have some subs, but one of their subs that's works in a purely fly by night kind of situation ends up being the source of the breach. Well, now I'm reporting up my chain, and that gets back to again, it's something that gets reported back to DoD. It's like, well, you didn't check all the way down your supply chain. So I think we'll see it more and more. But yeah, ultimately, you're accountable for the things that are in the contract up, and you're responsible to make sure that all of those subcontractors have met your requirements, and to ensure you put those requirements in the contracts that you push down. And not just the requirement, but some way to ensure that if and when there is a breach, that there's some way to recover from that breach, right? Because because it's written in the contract doesn't mean that it's always going to happen. And that's the point of insurance is, or liquidated damages. You could have a licensed and bonded situation. You could have an escrow account. I mean, there's been software agreements where it was like, okay,
Yep.
well, you're going to develop the software for us, but we're going to put this money that we're going to pay you in escrow until we know that the software works, and that way we know that you're going to continue to support us because you aren't going to take the money and disappear, right? So yeah,
Wonderful
I mean,
tips.
there's
And yeah,
yeah
and
ways
these
to
is
protect.
Right. And that's the kind of accountability and responsibility needs to be clearly defined. But even though from, a small business perspective, they might, my recommendation is, well, okay, now you're going to look at as a sub and sub, now we got to look at, well, what is the insurance policy? Like what you have alluded to earlier. Now it's not just about the compliance requirement. It's what is that insurance policies to drive this type of communications? Is it built into the contract? And then from that perspective, how do we responsible? How do we take the accountability as a small business to make sure that we can address our contractors, the primary contractors requirement? And then we talked about that in in different case studies, manufacturing. So we did a audit, well, assessment for manufacturing. So the project went on 6 months. Great, we are done. Now that manufacturer is happy, but there is some aspect of the information in that they are not disclosure. They're not disclosing for the reducing the cost perspective. Go back into the scope of work. Now with this type of engagement that nobody knows that they're not disclosing anything, we're done with the assessment, we leave, and now something happened in that environment. So I'm going to tie it into one of the points that we're going to talk about is the implementation roadmap. How do we prepare this type of implementation roadmaps and knowing the subcontractor, the subs, like you said, the fly by nights eventually going to disappear? What would be your recommendation, and why should the business executive should take actionable steps to define that defensible scope?
Well, I think that, I mean, what your scope just did was grow exponentially, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's exactly why I tied into the
Yeah,
element of cost, right? Or
right.
insurance policy. Yep.
This is again, the fundamental question is what is your most valuable asset, and are you going to expose that asset to risks throughout all of these vendors, or is this something you can bring in house? Do you need to hire, do you need to have so many vendors, right? I mean, and I think that's one of those questions, because when you really look at, like, what is this vendor, what is it that they provide, what is it that they actually do for you? um, is that something that one of your other existing vendors could be doing? Are you do you have duplication across your capabilities that you could streamline and reduce those risks? Because that's
Right.
going to, again, reduce your surface area. It's going to reduce the total number of relationships that have the potential to have problems happen between you. So
Right.
I mean, it does come down to a really good argument for um, doing true capabilities assessments of what is it that this vendor does, and is that business critical, and where does that fit in my business impact
Oh,
analysis,
but I'm a
et cetera.
CISO. I'm already paying XYZ dollar, $1 million contract. Real story. I just had this
Yeah.
conversation with a hospital with 10,000 staff. You know what? We spent $1 million purchase this XYZ solutions. You know what? Hey, you know what? Even though we're
Yeah.
only using about 50% of it, that's the
Which is a lot.
best.
Yeah.
Which is that's the best case already. So most of them I just, but then I just keep on telling the CFO or the CEO, say, look, we need to continue this contract because we have to rely on this contract. But when this solution's only producing 20% of the result or 50% of the result in the best case scenario,
Yeah.
so this is the area that I see, and why in the beginning of the conversation I was kind of quiet, because you touched on, both of you had touched on this kind of accountability based on the different individual role as a stakeholder in that organization.
Yeah.
Right.
We only looking at like this, it's like, this is my responsibility only. I don't care. I already got the XYZ company, the best in the world. Nobody get fined by buying the Marvel back in my telecom days. So this is what I'm going to use, right? No, if something happened to them, well, we've seen the whole crowd strike. environment brought down Microsoft, and Microsoft now, I don't know how many lawsuit is going on, or if there is any lawsuit. I can't keep up with that already. So these are the supply chain issues that the CISO, the technologists will continue to just say, I'm going to rely on XYZ solution.
And
You as
the
a prime and the legal
yeah.
side, what do you say to that?
Well, and the question will be, okay, so show me how you've configured that technological solution, because 9 times out of 10 they buy the tool and they don't hire the team of people that's required to manage the tool, right? So it's never properly implemented and it's never properly configured, and so they're spending $1 million a year on a tool. We'll call it, it's 4 letters, starts with S, ends with W. um, but it's a
I
great
hope we're not
tool.
going to get sued. We're hosting this.
But I mean, it's a great tool, but it has overhead, right? And
Right.
if you haven't figured that overhead into your acquisition, then not only is your CISO who asked for the tool gonna is that a failure, but the CIO and CTO who should have been evaluating it and saying, well, what do we need to do to support that tool when it gets brought in? Well, that's why all those executives should be on the same level, is because they all have an input into that discussion and should have some say into what tools we're going to add to our environment, because it does impact other places besides just your information security team or just your
Right.
your CIO's team, your IT department. IT
Right.
wants, some RMM tool to manage the the endpoints or whatever, but is that RMM tool approved? Is it a cloud service provider? Is it FedRAMP ATO'd or equivalent? Are those things in place? Yeah. So
And that's the, for my answer. Thank you,
yeah,
for your support, because I really appreciate, you make me feel I'm doing something right. We're doing something right. Because when you say that, it's like, okay, what is the word comes to into mind is benchmarking, right? So this
Mhm.
is a very important part of the process, and the continuous measure and monitoring what we're doing, even including the tool we selected might be 2 or 3 years ago. It's like, okay, does that really tool help us based on the benchmark? And of course, to fully disclosure, we're using Center for Internet Security as a benchmarking tool that put it onto our open source for evaluation process. I just want to say that, oh, look, you trust us as a vendor, but don't trust blindly. You got to
yeah,
trust and
but
verify
verify.
at the same.
Yeah,
Exactly, right? So
yeah,
it's a famous phrase that we've been using it for decades, but it
yeah,
doesn't build into a lot
It's
of
a
business
Russian
culture.
phase.
Yes, I don't want to say it. Yeah, of course, because we in the United States, it was a Russian phase and to start it with, but then of course
yeah,
our president, ex-president, former president Ronald Reagan, make it famous in our
yeah,
country, right?
yeah.
So this is, of course, is, when even the financial executive asked me, well, how can I trust you, Stanley? Because this is it's kind of like a catch 22. Well, should we trust you? But what kind of length that we go, or what kind of depth that we would go as our risk assessor, independent third party risk assessors, or MSP, MSSP, whatever the acronym you want to throw in there. We just continue to call it as cyber risk governance, because it's a system, it's a process that you keep on evolving all the time on a daily basis when it comes to technology, but it might be on a monthly basis when it comes to compliance. It might be on a hourly basis when it comes to financial risk. So all of these elements, it comes back into how can we benchmark? What do we select as a benchmark in
Right.
our corporate culture? But again, of course, I want to make sure from the legal perspective, is that a good enough best practice? Because when I talk to, at one time I talked to Attorney General and said, well, are we going to get sued? Well, they say, what, we can only sue so many people we have because we have limited resource. So who's going to be my target? Well, it's up to the team's evaluation, but we definitely know that we're going to pick on the people who do not follow best practice. And now the best practice for us is also against benchmarking as well. Well, don't take our word, trust but verify, trust and verified.
Right.
So would that able to get us off the hook? Well, of course we won't know until things, things
No, I mean,
happens.
and you have acts of God, force majeure, things that are going to cause contracts to fail
Thank
as
you.
well,
Yes.
which is why, despite your best practices, despite all of those things happening, things that we thought were low risk because although the impact may have been super high, if we'd actually been honest about what the impact was, the likelihood was so low, right? Until it happens, like a pandemic,
Yeah.
right? Up until COVID happened, if you were to ask a business, hey, have you thought about what's going to happen if all of a sudden everything gets shut down and people can't come into the office, for
What are you,
2
crazy?
years? Right? But now that's a conversation that we have, and we're like,
Mhm.
oh well, yeah, we can all pretty much work remotely. We all
Yep.
have, high speed broadband into our houses. I mean, we couldn't even do what we're doing now 10 or 15 years ago because the infrastructure didn't exist for us to all have this kind of bandwidth, right?
Well, actually,
So
I have to dispute on that because I keep
yeah,
telling people when Skype was happening 20 years ago, I said, why do I
right.
need to
You're right.
fly all the way out there for one meeting? Can we?
No, you're right.
No, no, no. It's better to come and meet. So, I have to disagree
Yeah,
because, as a technologist,
yeah,
this is how we can make costs more efficient, right? Or
yeah.
managing and justifying the cost. It just are people willing to make, or the C-suite and the board of director, are they willing to make it as a cultural change
Mhm.
Yes, and
and
that's the part
leverage the
is
innovations?
right,
But they
right.
don't. I'm going
Because
to go back into no MFA days because it's easier for me.
I mean, you're right. We were briefing on Adobe Connect at at 8 or 9 battalion headquarters that were spread out throughout the entire country of Iraq to a brigade headquarters, um, all using Adobe Connect on the secure SIPRNet side, right? In the year 2000. So you're right. The technology really, we've had the ability to do these things. It's the cultural shift that was required to get everybody to be like, oh, I guess I need to learn how to use Teams and Google Meets and actually know how to get my camera to work and all that stuff. Yeah,
Yeah,
you're
and
right.
this is the part that it takes expert like you as a legal to make that interpretations and make it into actionable.
Yeah.
People like me from the like us in the technology world, yeah, we can blab it all day. Oh, XYZ tool is great. This is the way that we should practice. But it
So
has been turned to a deaf ear for decades
yes, and you
since I've
and
been
and
working on it.
if you're relying on the legal profession folks to make that happen, I don't. I wish I could say they would be leading that charge, but I still know lawyers that would be happy to be working in WordPerfect.
Well, you know what? I think it needs to change the wave of
Yeah.
how, we talked about the narrative starting, and, Sean and I doing this still 5 years later. We see the light at the end of the tunnel because now people are more managing like a risk rather than a technology component.
Right.
So as a risk, now that's why we've been talking, but now we try to get it into the financial, the CFO of the world to understand all of these and basically leveraging the cost element into justifications into this type of processes. But more importantly, go back into the trust but verify. It's just that, the culture needs to not just looking, oh, I mean, they already invested, we know that they already invest a lot of dollars into cybersecurity. It's just how can we that's what our job do is how do we customize, extract those system data, and about this, and then put it into the dashboard environment as unbiased as holistic as possible. And this is where the element that from your perspective as a legal counsel, well, what is the interpretation of best practice and then benchmark against it. I hope that I didn't, stuff word into your mouth now.
No, no. I mean, I think the place where you're going to have the pushback is who gets to define what those best practices are,
Mm.
right?
Great
You know,
question.
where does that come from?
Great point.
But that's
And
where it
that's
goes back to using those benchmarks that we use. Those are
right.
generally understood as,
Yeah,
best
and if you can
practice.
get everybody to buy into using the CIS bench practice or those benchmarks as best practices. I know that I had the conversation at the beginning of the CMMC world in 2020, and it was a conversation about that. We were talking about something pretty simple like password length, right?
Mm.
Mhm.
And the point was, well, you get to, as the organization, you get to define this as what we call an organizationally defined value. And I
Right.
said, here's the thing. You have a choice. You can either go out and look at a benchmark like CIS and see what they say, and you can use that as that, well, that's the generally accepted practice, best business practice out there. So we can justify using what they said. Or you can do your own risk assessment and you can just, but if you don't use the benchmark, then you're going to need to be able to show your work on how you arrived at the decision that you did to do what you're going to do. So if you decide you want to have a 4-digit password, then that's it. you know, and your password policies are really not difficult at all and really easy to break. Well, you're gonna have to be able to show why that you think that that's sufficient to secure your assets. And you'll have to show an assessor that or an auditor that if you expect them to buy off on the decision you made. So
And that ties into one of the comments from our audience is a good point. It's all about incentive. Of course,
yeah.
we know business want to make money, having to spend money. I'm just quoting from the comments. Having to spend money is antithetical to a business objective. This is
Right, it
precisely
is.
why legal incentive,
Timothy's right.
a stake, is required. Yeah, I couldn't see, so
Yeah, that's
Timothy.
right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so this is, it ties it back into the incentive. And from my perspective, from NetSwitch perspective, if I have to, again, transparent to disclosing our sales aspect of things. So 2 seconds. It's about measure and monitor and ongoing measure and monitor, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Benchmarks, best practice, legal framework, all of that baked into our product development cycle. But what would you say, Orion, from that perspective? The
um
legal incentive, the stake is really that's how
yeah,
hard do
well,
you push to that?
let's go
Yeah,
with what is, how do we define negligence, right? um, it's going to be acting outside what a reasonable person in the same situation would act, and
Right.
that's going to be, this is why we have all these cases that in tort law about what is, were you negligent in what you did. And so you're going to have experts on both sides saying, well, this was reasonable because this person was 22 years old, they had this level of experience, this as a driver, whatever. So it's then it's going to be, okay, as a small or medium sized business of this size with these resources, is it reasonable that they took that risk, right? And if it's not reasonable, then it's negligence. And if it's and if it's really bad, then maybe it rises to something above basic negligence. But
well, but this is a very good point because now it goes back into what I keep talking about, cost justifications. And from what
right.
we know, it's like cybersecurity is supposed to be, you take a stand that is 3 to 5% of the revenue, right? And we know that is very underspent drastically when it gets to the smaller size of the organizations. So is that an excuse because I'm smaller size organization? I only spending 0.3% of the of the
Well, that so
standard
so
budget, right?
I mean, again, in that civil courtroom, you'd
Yeah.
have a bunch of experts on each side saying, well, all the other businesses that are similarly situated are doing the exact same thing. So by definition, that becomes reasonable, right? That's, you are acting as a reasonable company. And the reason for that is, if I didn't act that way, my profit is going to be reduced. I won't make it as a company, right?
Right.
So in order for me to compete, I had to take that extra levels of risk on and not spend the amount that I wanted to spend on cybersecurity, um, because none of my competitors are.
Right.
And that's where um, a regulatory body or a insurance companies can step in and fix fix the baseline, right? So it's not a race to the bottom, so that all of your competitors are also having to do the right thing and having to put their security in place. Because yeah, I mean, given to the market, forces of the market, the incentive is going to be to do it the least expensive way possible. And that may mean that every time we fail, we start a new company, we go bankrupt and start a new company, rather than doing the things that would protect the company and would protect the information, would protect the assets, right? So
And
yeah,
that goes to the
Oh,
conversation about
wait.
CMMC. Go ahead.
Sean, very important point.
yeah,
Did we pay Orion to say that?
No,
Okay, good. Because,
we're
Orion,
not even paying for the attorney's time today.
thank you. So thank you. Because
by the
now
way,
one point I
this
want
is
to
not
point
legal
out.
advice, nothing I have said.
That's true. That is
Disclaimer,
true.
disclaimer.
Not legal
Yeah.
advice.
So one thing that, because why I said that is we people who watches our Unity demo, that we talk about the peer index.
Yeah,
And that's exactly why we want to build the community to drive data analytic to that peer index. So that size of the organizations, the different framework on the compliance, the size of the organization on geographic area, they can look at that. And that's why we bring in the university as a capstone project and try to do that as a whole, so people can actually measure that. Sorry, Son, that's all I have
That's
to
all right.
say. And
What I was going
yeah,
to say was, Orion, you're seeing this within CMMC relative to your conversation about what the spend is amongst yourself and your competitors.
right.
Is that everybody was complaining about the cost it's going to be for a small business to bear the cost for CMMC compliance and what they have to do. Well, so are all your competitors. They all have to bear the same cost. And the
Right,
DoD has said
right,
that those costs are
right.
an acceptable cost through the
So
contract
the
supply
floor
chain.
should be the same for everybody, right?
Correct.
And but here's in specifically in the CMMC world, where the problem is that everybody's they're combining the costs to be in compliance with NIST 7012 and DFARS 800-171 with CMMC. It might cost your company $200,000 to put in controls to meet the requirements of NIST of NIST 800-171, but that's not the cost. That's the cost of compliance, right? But that's not the cost of CMMC. CMMC is the certification,
Right.
and that certification, all the C3PAOs that are out there are going to be competing on how much that's going to cost. And right now, while there's a huge demand, it's about $40,000, right? I think that's about the going rate. I don't know. I'm not the one making the, signing the checks on this, but I'm pretty
Right.
sure that most of those, that's kind of the ballpark for where you should be expecting to get your certification. Now, does it make sense to me that honestly, a SOC 2 certification looks at more things and is actually more comprehensive than a CMMC certification, and I can get a SOC 2 for 3,500? No, it doesn't make sense to me right now. But that, that goes to the integrity of the auditors in the SOC 2 world and the companies that are selling those certifications for SOC 2. And that the demand is high over here on CMMC for CMMC certification. So, I mean, I would expect once there's more C3PAOs and once not as many companies are requiring that certification today, right? We
Right.
get into a cycle of this, that the cost for those CMMC certifications are going to go down too. Because if it only takes me a week or 3 days with the assessor to sit down and do it, it's not going to cost any more than the ISO certification did that I got for 5,000, or the SOC 2 certification that we got for 5,000. I mean,
Right.
those it's going to normalize, especially since in reality CMMC is a less comprehensive look than those other frameworks are.
And again, if it goes to the cost being existential to your organization, it goes to what you were talking about before. Is CMMC worth it for your business
Right,
to go for that?
right.
Or is it such a small part of your overall business? Go spend your resources elsewhere.
And there are people out there that do the math for you on this, right?
Yep.
yeah,
If you have a ISO 27001 certification, you've opened up your market to X number additional customers,
Correct.
because those customers are looking for that. If you don't have it, then that market is not available to you. Same with CMMC. If you have your CMMC certification, you've opened up yourself to X number of additional businesses that are going to want that, whether it's required or not. They may start to just ask for it.
Yep.
And so, do you want? Is that market share worth it to you? And is it worth the cost, the $40,000 cost right now to get that certification?
Correct.
It's a business decision.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much, Orion. On that note, it's top of the hours. Thank you very much for joining us and have this discussions. Of course, this is something that I think that it's a rabbit hole we can continue to dive into deeper.
We didn't even touch on AI governance.
I don't want to talk about it. Otherwise, people is going to shoot me again. Yeah.
We really appreciate all the comments from everybody today, too.
Yes.
Thank you very
much. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Orion.
Bye.
Bye.
Orion,